Around the time of Jesus' birth in Bethlehem in Judea, there was, up in Galilee, a man named Judas. He was unhappy about the Jewish people's status as a colony of the Roman Empire, and he shared his unhappiness with others. It probably was even the very same census that brought Mary and Joseph away from their home in Nazareth in Galilee to Bethlehem in Judea that also inspired Judas of Galilee and his comrades to rebel against their Roman oppressors. They failed, of course, and Judas was killed and all his followers were scattered. The historian Josephus attributes the birth of the political party known as the Zealots to Judas of Galilee. A splinter group of the Zealots known as the Sicarii later ended up being the reason the Romans sacked Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, chasing them to Masada, where they all killed themselves rather than starve under Roman siege or be captured. Aside from the connection of timing with Jesus' birth and the census, none of what I just told you is in the Bible. Not the revolt, not the birth of the Zealot party. Masada isn't mentioned. The destruction of Jerusalem isn't even in the Bible, except if you count the prophecies of Judgment Day, of which Jerusalem's destruction is an intermediate fulfillment. But Judas the Galilean is. Peter and several other apostles were arrested by the Jewish ruling council known as the Sanhedrin, the same Sanhedrin that condemned Jesus to death. An angel of the Lord broke the apostles out of jail and sent them back into the temple courts to preach about Jesus. This upset the Sanhedrin somewhat, and they arrested the apostles again. They ordered them to cease preaching, and Peter and the apostles confessed they had no intention of obeying such a command. "We must obey God rather than human beings," they said, which upset the Sanhedrin somewhat more, like to the point of wanting to condemn some more people to death. A Pharisee and teacher of the law named Gamaliel stood up to address the group. "Men of Israel, consider carefully what you intend to do to these men. Judas the Galilean appeared in the days of the census and led a band of people in revolt. He was killed, and all his followers were scattered. Therefore, in the present case, I advise you, leave these men alone. Let them go, for if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourselves fighting against God." Judas of Galilee is only in the Bible at all as an object lesson. He's a case in point. His rebellion was a merely human endeavor, and therefore it failed. And if the apostles' little preaching venture was a similarly human endeavor, it would fail too, entirely on its own. But if not, then the Sanhedrin would discover themselves opposed to God himself. Only they would discover it too late. Judas of Galilee made Gamaliel's point as he advised the Sanhedrin to wait and watch the apostles and see if God was with them. Of course, he was. 2,000 years later, and the Zealots, the Sicarii, and Judas of Galilee are long gone, the preaching of the apostles is alive and well. God has been with the preaching of Jesus. He always will be. And Gamaliel's advice is still very sound. Our culture lately has been somewhat obsessed with deciding right now what side of history is the winning side. And maybe it makes sense to tear down statues commemorating the guys who definitely lost the Civil War. I don't have any issue with that. But isn't it kind of weird to make biopics about still living celebrities? And does it make sense to let the celebrities themselves write them? And how sure can we be about which political party is good and which one is evil when they're both, and history hasn't had time to vindicate or condemn their policies? Maybe we'd all do well to recognize that about which God has not yet spoken is not yet for us to judge. On the other hand, Gamaliel was very late in giving his advice. As obviously as God hadn't been on the side of Judas of Galilee and the Zealots, so obviously was God on the side of his Son, whom he sent expressly to be killed, and whom he raised from the dead, and whom he gave authority over everything, and who was using that authority to perform miracles, pour out his Spirit, and build his church on the teachings of his apostles. Just like Judas of Galilee, Jesus had been killed and his followers scattered, but unlike Judas, Jesus' scattered followers became the holy Christian church, against which hell itself is powerless. Judas is gone. The Zealots are gone. Rome is gone. Jesus remains, and so does his church. And I've run out of hands, but consider this. Judas of Galilee rebelled against the census that put Jesus in Bethlehem to be born according to prophecy. And the party he started brought the hand of Rome down on Jerusalem according to other prophecies. So God had been on Judas' side, just not in the way Judas and his followers had wanted. God used them to accomplish his will, to be on Jesus' side, which is to say, our side, on the side of our salvation, which was Judas' side too. He probably was looking forward to the coming Messiah too. He just got a little distracted by politics and then killed by them. So maybe let's land there, not judging that about which God has not yet spoken, recognizing the supreme importance of what God accomplished in history in Jesus, and taking a big step back from the distraction of politics and focusing a lot more on Jesus. Because all politics will eventually become a footnote. And it's all only an object lesson, a case in point. The point being that God is in charge, always. And to us, that means one thing: Jesus. You and I are dust and breath, loved by God, bought by Jesus. This podcast is written and produced by me, Ethan Cherney, a WELS pastor serving Our Savior Lutheran Church in Pomona, California. Get in touch on Facebook at Dust and Breath Pod, on Twitter at Dust Breath Pod, or by emailing dustandbreathpod@gmail.com. Outro music arranged and performed by Mr. Peter Shawy, who is like gold refined 7 times. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you could leave a review in iTunes or just share an episode on social media, I'd really appreciate it. It's the only way other people can find the show. Now, go do what God made you to do. Be who God called you to be. Go see what God can do with dust and breath and faith in Jesus, his Son.